Okay. Good morning, all. My name is Taisha Martin. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for CNY Housing. I'd like to welcome you to the housing portion of the Syracuse Urbanism Conference. For the next 45 minutes or so, we look forward to discussing smart growth in CNY as it relates to housing, and afterwards taking some of your questions. It's an honor to help lead this discussion in such an esteemed panel. I would now ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Could you please share with us your name, occupation, and a little bit about what you do in your role and how long you've been involved in housing? And I can start with you, Ryan.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Ryan Benz. I'm the managing partner of a real estate development company called Redev CNY. We're a development company in general. Mostly what we do is focus on affordable housing. We do have market rate commercial properties as well, but the bulk is in affordable housing, and we've been doing this for about 6 years here in Syracuse and across central New York.
Good morning. My name is Frank Satira. I am a resident of the Near West Side here in Syracuse and live in a home that we refer to as the Bitternut Homestead Collective. This is a property that I purchased from the city for $1. This is prior to the land bank being in existence, and fixed that property up and now live there collectively in a 3-bedroom home with 4 residents. And our goal is to convert that into a limited equity housing cooperative in Syracuse that is community controlled through a share process, and bring rights and responsibilities from individual owners to consolidated owners to the actual neighborhood that a property is located in. And I have a little bit of experience in cooperatives as a part of the Syracuse Cooperative Federal Credit Union, where I was board chair for 10 years. So, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Zach Zeliff. Oh, sort of echo there. I am Chief of Staff for State Senator Rachel May, and been that for the last 6 years. Work a lot on housing legislation at the state level. Briefly worked at CNY Fair Housing before Taisha was there many years ago. So background in fair housing, and yeah, work a lot at the state level on various types of legislation and budget items, and excited to share and talk about what's going on here in Syracuse.
Good morning, everyone. I am Kimone Jordan. I currently serve as the Director of Housing and Neighborhood Planning for the city. Currently in my role, I oversee the city's foreclosure process, tax foreclosure specifically, but also help support a variety of initiatives related to stabilizing housing, but also increasing code compliance across the city.
You will note on our list of panels, Walt Dixie is supposed to be here. He experienced a death in his family this morning, so he will not be joining us. For those of you who know Walt, please feel free to reach out and send your condolences. So thank you for introductions, and we'll get going. As you are all aware, rent in Syracuse is infamously outpacing rent in the rest of the state. Correspondingly, buying a home with record price increases, a house shortage, and heightened interest rates has never been harder. Likewise, home rehabilitation also carries heavy renovation costs. I'd like to ask our panelists to discuss what ongoing or upcoming initiatives, projects, or policies ought a conference goer support to begin to address the housing problems that our community is facing, and why that is important. I'd like to ask Kimone to start. I think she has some statistics for us that might be helpful.
Sure, thanks. So within the city of Syracuse, it's important for us to understand how area median income is broken up and how locally we compare to our larger metropolitan statistical area, but also Onondaga County as a whole. So according to census data, one-year estimates from 2023, the area median income for Syracuse was only $47,500. But when we look at the metropolitan statistical area, which includes Syracuse and some of our adjacent suburbs, the MSA is actually $70,000. And when we look at the county, it's $74,000. So that really shows that Syracuse does have a high concentration of low-income households and also households that are severely housing cost burdened, which means they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing.
Mo, can you talk to any projects that you're working on to address this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about the Syracuse housing strategy. So in 2022, the city commissioned CZB, which is a small urban planning firm out of Maine. We invited them in to take a look at the city of Syracuse and help us understand what's happening on a market level. Not only help us compare what's happening in our neighborhoods to the county and national averages, but also help us understand and reflect on some of the work that we've done to date. So the housing study and the strategy reveal that in Syracuse we have two major issues. So the first one being a significant market gap issue, where the amount of money that it costs to rehab and repair and even build new far exceeds the end property values. And as a result, a lot of homeowners that can afford to reinvest in their property aren't, because it's not necessarily the best financial investment. And alongside that, just ensuring the area median income for the city, we see that we have an affordability issue where a high concentration of low-income households are actually within the city. So in answering your question on what we're doing, the strategy has really given us some guidelines for how we can be a lot smarter about how we fund and support and decide locations for current affordable housing development projects, but it also gives us a lot of advice and guidance on how we can hedge against displacement.
Thank you, Kamon. Zach, would you like to tell us a little bit about your policy?
Yeah, so from our office's perspective, a lot of the rent increase is due to a lack of supply and quality supply. And I think at the moment we find ourselves in Syracuse, that's both market rate and affordable supply. That's true many places, but in a place that's experiencing growth for the first time in a while, we with a lot of folks who don't have the incomes to pay for higher rent, that's a tricky puzzle to figure out. So what we think about, we've written legislation or have legislation in. Well, we have legislation to already introduced. Some has been passed and some will be introduced soon. But we focus on, we have a land use bills, we have a building code bill, which is designed to allow more single stair buildings, which are much more efficient and affordable to build. We have an environmental review bill, which is designed to allow more affordable housing to be built by reforming our environmental review process. What we really find right now is that the financing piece is really difficult. There's a lot of folks, around the city who have their land use permits and are ready to build but can't get financing, and that's for market rate housing. So some other states have taken steps with this same sort of problem. Massachusetts, notably, they have a revolving loan fund, which is called the Massachusetts Acceleration Fund, which is designed to provide lower cost financing and turn those market rate buildings into mixed income buildings. So you get both more market rate and affordable units as well at various levels. So a lot of those types of financing pieces we're looking at and working on legislation and hope to see in next year's budget, because we need to be doing more than we are at the moment is our office's stance.
So as far as affordability goes, I'm not as versed in the statistics and policies, but I wanted to share in our example at Bitternut how somebody living in our home would compare if we look at that $47,000, I believe, average income, and the rent composing 30% of that income. So in our case, and really kind of wild thing about this kind of a housing situation, right, is it's adaptable and fluid, and it's not the same in every situation. It scales up, it scales down pretty easily. It's based a lot on, you know, the type of people living in the home, either singles or couples or small families or larger families. So, you know, take this with a grain of salt until you look at the specifics of, you know, whatever situation. But if we look at our situation with 4 people living in a single family home, 3 or all of them with incomes in this case, we're looking at our housing costs being only 12% of our actual income, and that includes utilities, that includes repairs and maintenance and new capital projects. It's well beyond anything related to just, you know, rental costs. And once we get to the point of this conversion from single ownership, so I have the single ownership right now, and once we get to the point of conversion into a cooperative corporation, then the money that people are paying as rent or as individual or family contributions into the pool to pay for living in a limited equity housing co-op will then be, part of it will be transferred into equity for them, not just for me. So I'll essentially be selling my equity to the renters or the housing members. So they're not just paying rent anymore, they're paying rent that gets transferred into equity, can build individual wealth, can build family wealth, and is partially can be supported by community members within the neighborhood as well through the share stock system of a cooperative corporation.
Well, the affordability challenges of the community, Smo did a great job in the market study of highlighting those challenges across the community. I'll give you guys real numbers. We worked on a project down the street here in 2017 and 18, and our hard costs of a historic renovation were about $145 per square foot. We did the Penfield building, the building with the house on it, and my construction costs were about $400 a foot, right? And that's about 5 or 6 years. They're up, you know, whatever that percentage is, you know, more than double. And that's material increases, that's labor increases, that's a different project, you know, a little bit more challenging. But the biggest challenge, you know, I think to the credit of the housing market, our study, is that disparity between how much it costs to fix up our dilapidated housing stock across the community, and then how much can you charge to rent, can you afford to offset your construction loans. So I think what Zach and the Senator's office is doing or looking into from the Massachusetts model for cheaper borrowing costs is important, but that doesn't make up the full difference. So I'll say that one of the things that we're doing at REDEV CNY right now is focusing on a new program through New York State. And I'll say this program, I'm a big fan of what New York State has done in general, and that they've allocated millions of upstate development funding for communities that are known as, what's the allocation? Syracuse is one. It's a pro-housing community. So if you're a pro-housing community, that opens up hundreds of millions in funding for your municipality. And the city's done it, and East Syracuse done it, DeWitt's done it, so there are a lot of these suburbs that focus on this. But what we've been doing is a new program through HCR that subsidizes our construction costs if at the backside we end up condoing and selling these homes to first-time home buyers. And we're doing this project in East Syracuse right now. We're about to start construction on a project on West Fayette Street utilizing this as well. It's at 1117 West Fayette Street. And again, real numbers here. On my West Fayette Street property, it's costing us about $375,000 per unit to build these homes. Because of the subsidy programs through New York State, we'll be able to sell them to first-time home buyers for about $160,000. And then it's constrained to an income band of between 80% of AMI and about 100%. So it's still affordable, but it's promoting home ownership. And I love what we were chatting about so far in terms of through home ownership and through equity, through a condominium or a co-op or whatever, you build equity, and then you change, the cycle of generational poverty. You give people a chance to get ahead, through home ownership, which is a challenge. There's a lot more that could be said about then how do you take a comparable model and bring that to the city, because this model will not work in real numbers again. So if you're making $47,000, your average income is like 40 or 50% of AMI, which means you're not eligible for the program I just described. So how do you reinvest the dilapidated housing stock in our community so that it's either renter ready or home ownership ready? And I'm a big fan of home ownership because through that stabilizes neighborhoods, creates civic engagement, creates neighborhoods and all those things. But when you have 70 or 65 to 75% of our poorest people renting, right, then they're not worried about neighborhood placement. They're trying to survive. Right, so we need to start trying to change some of these, and the state's been a very important partner, and it's always a pleasure to work with it, but it's also a lot more needs to be done as well.
Thank you all. I realize that I've given some detail to the project and policy and initiative we've discussed, but do you have an example, or are you aware of anything that Syracuse might adopt or consider something similar? An immediate alternative, or a suggestion for improvements on something that already exists? Frank, are you aware of anything that you might like to discuss?
Am I allowed to be critical? Well, I have great respect for the work that nonprofit housing development organizations are doing in this city. Home Headquarters in particular has made a huge difference on the couple blocks that I live on, 600 and 700 blocks of Otisco Street, and adjacent streets there as well. I think that home affordability is something that has to be considered forward and not just current, because it's confusing as to what's going to be affordable in the future and what the individual actions of homeowners are going to be in terms of passing on affordability. It's something that may not be on everybody's list when we're talking about the idea of equity and wealth building. And so, some of those properties that were redeveloped, new homes that I'm speaking of on my block, are highly subsidized. Those properties were built and sold for a discounted price, and that's great for those homeowners. They're able to purchase and buy something that will provide them safe and structured housing, hopefully for as long as they need it. The question for me becomes, what do we look at for the future of affordability of any homes that are being built and sold and purchased right now? And so I know there's been some involvement throughout the city in the past with the idea of a community land trust. I know that Walt would probably be able to speak to that in terms of what Jubilee Homes has done in the past. But without some kind of profit control on the sale of a property at some point, you're looking at the potential of just values and currently continuing to inflate potentially and pricing out people who may need to purchase a home. Those are nice homes in my neighborhood that were built and that are now being lived in, but they're not affordable to probably 90% of the people in our neighborhood, right? So how do we make them affordable into the future, and potentially, the need of a combination of, or the addition of a community land trust model, and potentially the combination of a land trust model and a housing co-op model together.
Thank you, Frank. Would you like to come? Okay.
I'll jump in. There's been a couple of other great things that the city has done to promote affordability and just additional housing units in general. So the first thing I'll say is from a code perspective and from a zoning perspective, a new market rate housing, the city is requiring, I think it's 15% of units allocated towards an affordability component. So that does, the challenge there is you're not even seeing a lot of market rate units coming online because of the cost of construction relative to the amount of the debt. So that's why you've kind of seen kind of a stalemate there. But where you are doing units, or is that affordability requirement, I'll also say rezone has been very important to allow for additional development. And then also the city is exploring the good cause eviction, if you guys are familiar with this. Good cause eviction limits the amount of annual increases in rent, I think, to 10%, and also itemizes when can a landlord evict tenants, and just again make sure that everybody's following the proper laws. But it's really that limiting of the rent, which I think is an important, going back to what you were saying too, to make sure that people can continue to live in their homes over the long haul. I think the last thing I'll mention, this goes back to the early 2000s. But a lot of the neighborhoods and homes across Syracuse are either our historic districts or our historic buildings, which again allows for tax credits to allow for development. So the city and the state has done a lot to promote. More can always be done, but things like the Syracuse Trust, the Housing Trust, which was recently established, recently funded with I think $10 million, to kind of prevent or to prepare for a rotating, fund. There's a lot more that can be done, but I think we've done a lot already as well.
Yeah, Zach.
So looking at other governments around the country, one example is Montgomery County in Maryland. There was a big Times piece last year that I'm guessing a lot of people in this room might have seen. But it's a really innovative financial model, like to get affordability. I think we're all touching on this with the market study as well. We need to figure out how to either increase incomes or decrease costs, and to be able to actually get the units that we're talking about. Ryan talked about the affordability, inclusionary zoning piece, which is really important, but if people can't finance it, we don't actually get those units. So what Montgomery County in Maryland has done, it's called their Housing Opportunity Commission, which is their public housing agency. They've created a new financial model of developing and owning, continuing ownership of a public authority themselves, which allows them, like Frank was saying, to continue to set policy over time and get units as affordable as possible. It's flexible, fast, compared to traditional affordable housing development. And it's a really interesting model, especially with the amount of city-owned land that we currently have that's sitting vacant, and looking ahead to the 81 highway removal, which will open up a whole bunch of other land, thinking about financial models of how we can turn those opportunities into efficient, quality, affordable housing. That's one model that I think is really promising that the city could look at.
Zach, I hate to put you on the spot, but we did mention good cause eviction, and you do some policy work. Did you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I think that's really important policy. My boss was a longtime supporter. One thing in addition to what Ryan said, right now, if a tenant calls codes and they get a lease non-renewal, it's called, it's very difficult for them to prove that that's a retaliatory action, right? Like if my lease is up early next year, if I had called codes, and I've had a landlord where this has happened, and so has many tenants across the city, you want to call codes, but landlords sometimes, a lot of great landlords, I'm not trying to paint with a broad brush, but a lot of tenants are worried about that because they're worried if they cause trouble trying to advocate for better conditions, they will be non-renewed and have to move. And right now, you know, to prove that's retaliatory is very difficult. And even if you can prove that's retaliatory by going to court, getting a lawyer, retaliatory eviction measures only last, protections only last 1 year in current statute. So maybe you could get your lease renewed one more time, but then, you know, the next time it won't be. You have a 7-year-old in school, you're not trying to move every year. No one's trying to move every year. So in addition to what Ryan talked about, for those reasons of allowing tenants some security to be able to advocate for themselves in better conditions, I think it's a really important policy.
Thanks, Zach. Kimon, did you want to add to this?
Sure, thanks. So I think to the points previously made, Syracuse is doing a lot of work. You spoke about the pro-housing designation, our ability to be prioritized for funds like DRI, the Main Street program, but also different housing funding resources is really critical. I think also passing rezone will also have a major impact within the city of Syracuse. But there are also other models that other cities are approaching. So if you look at CHN or the Cleveland Housing Network, they found a way to use LIHTC or low-income housing tax credits from HCR to be able to do scattered site infill housing development and then have a lease-to-own program where the person would rent the property, they would learn about what it means to own a home, and then be able to transition into buying the property at an affordable rate in comparison to what the property's worth. So there are other models. I think also we've gotten a lot more creative about how we spend funds within the city. So I'm sure a lot of you know, but the city administers CDBG dollars, which are Community Development Block Grant dollars. And before, we would use CDBG for not only housing, but nonprofit, social services, things related to food, workforce development, funding community centers. But we've since changed the way that we'll be administering those funds. So now CDBG funds will be reserved mostly for housing, and then we'll build out a stronger grant program potentially funded through the city budget to be able to support community centers and more of those social service programs. So that's a step that the city has taken to improve the amount of funds available for housing developers that do want to build affordable housing.
Thank you, Kimon. I have one more question for our panelists, but I forgot to advise folks that if you have a question you'd like to ask the panelist, there's an online questions.org note there with a number to add. You can send me some questions. I have a series of questions here, and I will ask those at the end of the panel. So thank you all for sharing your insight and expertise. And now we have a little hypothetical all for you. So you've been transported 20 years into the future of Central New York, and your housing dreams have come true. What does it look like? What investment, infrastructure, or policy change made your future dream reality possible? And how do we get there? And I'm going to start with Zach.
I'm kind of a broken record, I think, but we really need flexible, creative financing, especially with this interest rate environment being very uncertain. And I think that's kind of a core piece we need to unlock to get to the city that we envision. Rezone does a ton of great stuff. I know there's a lot more we could do, but if you don't have the financing to build affordably, you know, we can't unlock. So I think different ways of different programs, like Kimon talked about, of creative, sustainable, at-scale financing, allowing a lot of the people in this room who are really smart at design and placemaking to create the city that we want to live in, and where people have safe, secure, affordable housing.
Ryan.
So I'm going to be a little critical because I think there's some architects in here. First thing I'd like to see is continued improvements at permitting and the entitlement process in general. I've been a long advocate for self-certification, where the design professional who is a state licensed registered architect or professional engineer can go in and get a building permit in one day because of their design credentials, which is a model that's literally across the United States. And we appear hesitant to bring it here to Syracuse. It drives me nuts. And or utilizing third-party reviewers to expedite the building permit process, which is challenging. Though great people love it, but it's challenging. Now, longer term, we need to continue to focus on, sorry, the echo messes with you. Home ownership opportunities. I think the CHN model is a home run model. If you're not familiar, definitely Google that. They utilize the low-income housing tax credit to create a rental property for 15 years. But to your point, Simone, you can use that on scattered site houses. Now, when you're trying to revitalize dilapidated neighborhoods, doing that through scattered site, which is single-family residences, and you do 50 to 70 at a time in a neighborhood, and then they're rentals for 15 years, but then the point of the program is that at the end of the 15 year, you sell it to ideally the tenant that's been living there, and you build them some equity over time, but you sell it just for the debt on the house, not the market value. So now they're able to buy the house they've lived in, essentially pay down your debt, but they're paying like $40,000 for these homes. It's a great model. We're looking into it currently right now. Now the challenge with that model is it's conditioned upon HCR funding, which is a limited resource that the state provides on an annual basis. It's extremely competitive to get these grant dollars, and currently the backlog of these applications runs like 2 to 3 years just to be approved and get that financing. So it's something that I know a number of non-for-profit developers locally are working on bringing to Syracuse, but it's going to take 20 years before you see the proceeds of that, because it's 3 years to go through the process, then a 15-year hold period. So you really need to do like 50 to 100 units every year for like 15 years before you really start to feel the neighborhoods becoming stabilized and increasing the home ownership component. I think those are my two wish list items here.
Come on, would you like to add?
Sure. So to your question, we're transported 20 years into the future. What do you see as success? I would say that the housing strategy implementation has been a success. So first and foremost, the consultants have advised that we invest in neighborhoods in waves. So currently right now, Salt Springs and Tip Hill are the first waves of the housing strategy implementation. And this is alongside a lot of the work that's already being done to support affordable housing development. So we are currently meeting with residents to help draft a neighborhood plan, and we also have CZB and our internal department doing a property by property analysis of every parcel within that neighborhood so that we have a very comprehensive plan for what intervention needs to take place. So if it's a homeowner that doesn't qualify for a lot of low-income programs, how can we use the Syracuse Housing Strategies Corporation to fund supports for them? How can we also increase code compliance on vacant and abandoned properties? And how can we leverage the land bank to acquire properties that they might not be able to get through foreclosure? So outside of expanding affordable housing options, how do we make sure that we're revitalizing neighborhoods on a whole, where people have improved quality of life and they feel safe and secure in their neighborhoods?
20 years, that's not very far in the future, so I'm going to have to be realistic and not too utopian. in my response here. But what I would like to see have happen by then is that we've taken control of our housing more into our own hands as neighbors in our communities, and doing that through owning our homes as cooperatives, as part of a distributed strategic ownership and acquisitions process, in which we use surplus from the ownership, operation, and community contribution of those cooperative houses to build a loan pool and a loan fund that encourages the next co-op purchase, or next property purchase and conversion into cooperative ownership, and through which maybe in 20 years, let's say our goal would be 10 acquisitions and conversions per year. I would love to see something like that in a realistic perspective.
So this brings our panel discussion to a close. However, I did receive a number of questions from you, and two of them involve the issue of our aging population. We at CNY Housing frequently come across the issue of seniors struggling to find affordable housing and living comfortably with their fixed income. Would anybody at the table like to comment on a project or program that they're aware of, or they're working on, or legislation that we have in the future for this? Frank, okay.
I'll be brief. Just to state that it's a great conundrum in that when you utilize, again, you can utilize low-income housing tax credits for seniors to create affordable housing, but again, it's a finite resource. And there's a lot of competition within that market. So I don't see the challenges getting any better, realizing that the baby boomers and the continued, that portion of the population continues to age and be income restricted. I think more needs to be done to focus on this population. But currently it's kind of being coalesced into the same challenges of low income, earners. So it's similar policies in place that are going to be focusing on, it's less of an age issue, unless it's a service oriented, but more of an income issue in terms of affordable housing based on the income levels.
I do hope to age in place in my current home, or a place very similar to it. I'm 52 years old. My other housemates are 40, 30, and 24. So I almost feel as if I can think in terms of someone who is envisioning aging with a lower, with younger generations in the home, coming up through and becoming owners of this property, pulling out my equity in creating theirs, and that purchase of my shares, as my living expenses. So I see, the kind of housing co-op model that I'm envisioning and moving towards implementing as one that can facilitate aging in place and do so in a multi-generational component.
I'd just like to add on to this issue of aging in place. Do you know if the city is or has plans on building accessible dwelling units? Is that incorporated in a future plan, or you, Ryan?
Yeah, I think that's something that the administration has been taking a look at, how we can expand opportunities for people who might have additional land or the financing available to build additional units, but it's definitely something we're looking at.
Okay, another question we have here. Someone asks us, are there any efforts to coordinate transportation development with housing development? I think it's a great question.
I think Rezone, not to speak for the city, but Rezone did a good job of trying to build that. And I think with bus rapid transit coming online, I think, getting our zoning correct to do that is a really good opportunity. I will just say at the state level, there was an attempt to do a transit-oriented development zoning bill that really would have only applied downstate because it required a train station, which we obviously don't have here. But it is something other states have implemented. Massachusetts, most notably, you are by right allowed to build at a certain density in a certain proximity from a transit stop. And I think that's really interesting. It's more difficult to do upstate in an environment in which we don't have as much clear transit that you can be like in a certain proximity from a train station. But hopefully with bus rapid transit coming online, we can start to think about that both state and local level, getting our zoning really correct. And the Hochul administration had tried, so.
Yeah, I would just add that a few years ago, the administration launched RNI, or the Resurgent Neighborhood Initiative, which identified smaller planning areas within neighborhoods across the city where we would focus housing development. So those areas were selected based off of availability of vacant land, either owned by the city or the land bank, proximity to neighborhood assets like community centers and schools, but transportation was another thing that we took a look at. So every RNI area is bordered by a commercial corridor. So whether that's South Salina, North Salina, your Erie Boulevards, your Burnett's, we wanted to make sure that the new housing that we were developing or that we were funding for affordable housing developers to develop, we wanted to make sure that housing was accessible in terms of having close proximity to transportation so that people could take Centro and walk from a very close bus stop to reach their home.
Yeah, the other thing too I'll say is that when you look at the concentrated poverty, most of it's within the city. And when you look at affordable housing projects, most are in the city. And so the question becomes, why is that? And how does transportation play a role in that? And why do we have continued affordable housing projects being built in the city instead of in North Syracuse or Liverpool or Baldwinsville or some of the other suburbs that are on DeWitt or whatever the case? And so I think transportation is part of it. When you submit the applications, HCR, New York State, does review transportation accessibility relative to the affordable housing projects that you're doing. Now you have a NIMBYism, you have a zoning challenge, you have the entitlement process, which is a challenge. But when you're trying to do affordable housing projects, generally the income is constricted to 30% of their AMI. These individuals may or may not have a vehicle, so the transportation is critical. Now, a lot of the services that are offered to these lower income folks are also downtown focused, so you want to make sure that you have accessibility to those. And so it's going to be a continued challenge. Centro does what they can with their budget and within their budget constraints. But ideally, again, I'm going to go to your 20-year vision question. How do we expand Centro routes to allow for additional affordable housing in some of the suburbs so that it's not concentrated, so that their children have the same opportunities of going to Beeville as people that live in those, suburban districts and such. So I think more can be done. I think HCR and the state and the city have done great work to date, but I think we need to find ways to continue to motivate Centro through additional funding, likely at the state or federal level, to continue to expand their service offering as part of that.
I know there's discussion later on transportation, so maybe some of these issues will be addressed. We have another question here. What is being done to prevent corporate ownership of homes by out-of-state property managers or corporations? This comes up a lot with us, especially in terms of larger apartment buildings and property management.
Yeah, so I would say from the city's perspective, using code compliance as a tool to make sure that when out-of-state owners are purchasing rental occupied properties in the city, making sure that we're getting inside of units to be able to cite violations and document non-compliance, and then being able to funnel those properties into the respective pipelines to achieve compliance, whether it's through the emergency repair program or nuisance abatement, getting the law department involved. I think that's been one step that we've taken.
Well, a lot of national firms are getting into the homeownership game. BlackRock has a kind of a black eye because I think they've bought in like 10,000 single-family homes across the United States, and they rent them out, and they take the rent. So what's being done to prevent that? The candid answer is nothing really, because it's what they can legally do. And so the question becomes, how do we as a community try to inspire additional homeownership opportunities? I don't know if you can necessarily blacklist an LLC from owning the houses, but I think we could probably give some additional creative thoughts on how do you mitigate or minimize those, and or how do you promote home ownership or local rentals. So maybe there's just a different way to look at that question. But the reality is there's not much you can do at the current level.
I will say, if you look at BlackRock and other similar entities' earnings calls, what those organizations, largely private equity organizations, say is that they engage in the most supply constrained markets that they can find, because that's where they can raise the rents the most. So in Atlanta specifically, they have said in their own earnings calls, if you listen to them, where they're justifying to their investors, their investments, hey, there's not a lot of supply here, so we can buy up properties and raise rents. So I think supply is an antidote to that. Not the whole solution by any means, but an important part to think about.
Well, obviously, this is a market-based problem, right? And so my solution is to remove properties from the market into this cooperative model. And so, we have to be proactive rather than reactive. As you've heard, folks, don't really have a good solution to how to prevent an outside corporation from coming in and buying a property. So proactively, we need to create our own corporations and buy those properties and control them on a community level.
Thank you. I apologize. We have somebody sitting at the microphone, and I hope I haven't left you there too long. Please feel free to ask your question.
All right, so it was mentioned a little bit earlier, just kind of in passing, about the I-81 viaduct project and how that's, potentially going to open up opportunities for new housing, and, obviously with the highway going away, that in and of itself improves local area housing, particularly low-income housing. My question is, with these projects opening up these opportunities, what is the city and what are, I guess, more conscious private developers doing to support and perhaps redevelop existing structures and existing properties?
Would anybody be interested in taking that question?
Yeah, so I guess I could speak to the Syracuse Housing Strategies Corporation, as well as CDBG and how the city administers home dollars. So through home headquarters, there are programs for existing homeowners as long as they income qualify and they're in an NRSA area. So that stands for Neighborhood Revitalization Strategy Area. And they have emergency repair funds. So say you are an income qualified homeowner and your water heater goes or your tank goes, or you need a new porch, there is funding available for that population. Through the housing strategy, we realized that there are no funding sources available for some of those middle income earners who may have a bit of savings but aren't able to do a more comprehensive rehab on their property. So the Syracuse Housing Strategies Corporation was developed, which will sort of serve as a flexible bank account to be able to provide some financing products for those homeowners. So whether it's a match loan that turns into a grant that's forgivable, we're looking to develop some funding sources to support that population as well.
And then I'll say that the land specific around the 81 coming down, I don't remember the exact acreage. It's 15 acres plus or minus. That's going to be available for redevelopment. But the bulk of that, about 9 acres of that, is in like a little sliver of kind of pockets that, from my understanding, is going to be allocated towards adjacent landlords, just to give them kind of the land or sell it to them at discount. which really opens up about 6 acres for additional development, of which there's been a great community discussion in terms of who should be receiving control of that. And there's a lot of appropriate stakeholders that are probably going to have some kind of negotiation to take some of it. What I'll say is I'm really excited at how that connects SU to downtown. I think that's our secret weapon as a community. You know, they say if you're curious about where the future development is, look for the artists, right? So it always kind of starts with like the younger millennials. And New York City was the West Village and the East Village. Now it's Williamsburg, right? So how do you get the creative or the young professionals, the culture of a community to become more integrated within the city? So I'm excited to kind of see how those two things connect. The Connect Recorder, if you remember that, when Nancy Cantor was our chancellor at SU, like had huge impacts on downtown. That's why the School of Architecture is downtown now. So I think that there's going to be a lot of really exciting new ideas that come through that. But in terms of how do you develop that acreage directly adjacent to it, I mean, it's going to need hotels, it's going to need affordable housing, it's going to need market rate, it's going to need commercial. And I think that who's going to be doing that, that's kind of still out there until it just kind of gets settled a little bit more.
All right, I have just a question or two left, but this is a great question. What is being done to support more multi-general housing in the community? This comes up frequently, especially on the north side. Would anybody like to comment on that?
Yeah, so I would add that, as you mentioned, that is a significant challenge for the Northside community, understanding that Northside houses a very large New American population, and oftentimes one family might move over with multiple generations, whether it's grandparents, they all often live together, so that means there is a greater need and demand for housing that has either an in-law suite or more bedrooms. I think we could do a lot more to support those needs on the north side. I think some of the challenges with the north side are that a lot of the parcels are very narrow, and as a result, a lot of developers don't build there just because we don't have the side assembly that's needed. But I think as we have finished the housing strategy, we're ready and excited to get more creative about how we acquire land. So looking at the land bank right now, a bulk of their stock has been provided by the city's tax foreclosure process. But the question is, how can we have the land bank begin to do strategic purchases to begin putting together larger sites that can then house some of these larger units? So that's one thing we are thinking of.
Building on that, this is certainly a very small piece of this, but I will shout out, since there's probably a lot of design folks in the room, that as part of this year's state budget, we put in a study that was based on one of my boss's bills for single stair buildings. I mentioned this earlier, but it allows you to build on narrower lots, multifamily housing. So it would, the study is supposed to examine is currently a 3-story limit on single-story buildings in outside of New York City. In New York City, it's 6 stories, so it's looking at going up to 6 stories, which helps with the specific design piece. These buildings are really great for multi-generational housing, allow you to build on narrower lots, and it was supposed to be in 3 years from this budget, so be on the lookout for that in about 2 years, and please build those buildings. They're so cool. I would love to live in one, but yeah, they don't really exist.
Thanks, Zach. I see we have somebody, Victoria, at the microphone. Would you have a question for the panel, Victoria? Okay.
I do, thank you. Zach, you mentioned the great things going on in Montgomery County, possibly borrowing some of that and bringing it to Syracuse. One thing that I do know that they do, and let me know if this does exist in Syracuse, I might not just know, that when properties take low-income tax credits, they go into a roll. So you can, say I was moving to Montgomery County, I can look up and they'll give me a full list of all the properties and how many units are available income-based. You know, even though they're the same as the, market race ones, but you can see that in real time and then apply and put into a lottery, similar to yours, Ryan, and folks can sort of just come up and still be able to have different options for housing. When we talk about like middle income folks or, you know, things of that nature, does that exist here?
I know HCR, the housing department that we've talked about, that administers the low-income housing tax credits at the state level, has something. I've heard mixed results. Like when people call our office, we tell them to look there, and we've heard mixed results of what that website is. But it's a good question. Maybe it's good. But I know they have something through HCR who administers the programs. I don't know if it's as good as what you're talking about, but I think that's a really critical piece. I don't know if the city has, I don't know.
Yeah, not that I know of, but definitely something that we could explore.
Just expanded to say the HCR has it when you're doing a new project. There's a specific website that you have to list your houses for rent, and that's where you have the applications and then generate. There's a lottery. When we did the Penfield building, to talk about the demand, we had 128 units and we had 570 applications for the 128. So that's where the lottery system comes in there. But interestingly, you're only required to use the HCR program when it's first for rent. And then after that, most non-for-profit developers have their own websites, so it's not consolidated. Like, I love that idea, but it's not that I'm aware of currently done that way.
I have one more question for our panel, and I think it's a great one. We've mentioned here a couple of federally funded programs and projects, and this question we have here is, how do we expect the upcoming change in the administration at the federal level to impact housing and development strategies in Syracuse, New York?
I really don't know, but I think, again, Ryan talked about low-income housing tax credit demand and the need, and currently the low-income housing tax credit program is our biggest source of funding for affordable housing, and it should be probably 20 times bigger than it is, and I don't think that's going to happen. So it's important for the rest of us at the state and local levels to think about different sources of funding to really get as many affordable units, and not just affordable rental units, if we can, like I said, flexibility, with available to different kinds of cooperatives and homeownership opportunities. I think that's really should be a focus given that uncertainty.
I'm just wondering from your perspectives if CDBG would be a target for defunding, since we're planning on putting a lot of housing towards that.
Yeah, I think all funding is vulnerable at this point. It's something that we've been thinking through at the city. I think it's possible that CDBG and home dollars will either remain the same or decrease. So to Zach's points, it's really important for us to really start thinking now about creative ways to continue funding affordable housing.
All right. I think that's a great way to wrap things up, to encourage folks to get involved in some housing advocacy programs and projects, and also reach out to us, find out what our organizations and what we're doing in the community, and get involved. That does wrap us up for the day. I think we're a little over, but I'd like to thank our panel for being incredibly awesome, and please feel free to ask them any questions. If you have anything to ask them afterwards, they should be around. And I'd like to thank you all for being a great audience. Thank you.